Welcome back to Smitty's Learning Room. Today we're going to learn about the principles of training and specifically having a look at progressive overload. So when we look at the syllabus, we look at the focus question, how does training affect performance? And we come down to the part of the syllabus where it says principles of training. And as we said before this video, we're going to look at progressive overload. We'll also have a look at how progressive overload can be applied to both aerobic and resistance training. So to start us off, we'll just have a look at the principles of training. Now there's 6 principles of training. We've got progressive overload, specificity, reversibility, variety, training thresholds, and warm-up and cool-down. Now there'll be 6 videos in the Principles of Training series for Core 2. And the first one that we're looking at today, we'll look at progressive overload, and obviously the other 5 videos will look at the other principles of training. When we start to have a look at the principles of training, it's a good way to try and connect them to something in your everyday life. So we look at the principle of progressive overload, and a really good analogy of this is, say, for example, walking up the stairs. You walk up the stairs every day to your class. In year 7, when you start, that could be quite challenging for you. You might feel like you're quite unfit and your legs get sore by the time you walk from, say, the 1st floor to the 4th floor. As you get accustomed to walking up these stairs and your body starts to get better at achieving that, you'll notice that the body, instead of just continuing and staying walking up those stairs at the same pace, you'll start to challenge yourself by walking up those stairs a little bit faster. So the better you get at something, or the more you improve your workload or increase your workload, you actually see improvements in performance in walking up those stairs. And this is very similar to the concept that we apply to training in relation to a progressive overload. So if we have a look at the graph here on the left, we see the workload here and the improvements up the left-hand side there. So for example, if this was a marathon runner and this was their training, I guess, or their improvements being graphed, this would be at the start of their program and they might only be running a couple of kilometres a day. Then when you start to increase the workload, so let's say they start running 5 kilometres a day, you'll see that they're starting to get improvements in their performance all the way up to, say, this might be here 20 to 30 kilometres a day within a week. They'll see improvements. So they continue to increase their workload to continue for improvements to that. Hence this concept of overloading. However, it's really important to understand that we get to this point where our body cannot go any further. And overload is not an endless concept. So once we push our body to the absolute maximum and we can't overload it anymore to get any benefits, this is where issues can start to happen with athletes, in that if we overload too far, we can actually end up with injury and illness because of this concept. So to ensure that peak physical performance is happening, it's important to employ this concept of periodization with training, and we'll look at that in another part of the syllabus a little bit more, but it's this concept of having phases of training to allow for recovery, which avoid injury and loss of motivation. And so that means that it's quite a structured training program that a coach has put in place to address the concept of overloading and making sure that their athletes aren't hitting a peak time or that peak stage of overloading prior to when that actually needs to occur. So in summary, the principle of progressive overload is more or less just allowing an athlete to increase their workload over time to allow for significant improvements. Overload is not endless, and therefore an athlete can reach their peak overload amount, and this is why it's important for coaches to have phases of training or allow for periodization. Okay, so now we jump across the syllabus into the right-hand side and have a look at how do we actually apply progressive overload to aerobic training and resistance training. So remember, from the videos beforehand about the types of training. We had aerobic training, anaerobic training, strength training, and flexibility training. So remember that resistance training is more or less strength training. So we look at how do we apply progressive overload to aerobic training. So we can increase the distance and have the same duration. We can have the same distance but decrease duration. We can increase the distance and increase the duration at the same time. We can increase the frequency, so how often they're doing this exercise. And we can decrease recovery time, for example, in interval training. So all these things here allow for that overload to happen in aerobic training, because some part of it is increasing or one part's decreasing, usually the recovery part or the time that the activity needs to be undertaken in. If we have a look at the resistance training, it's very similar in that we're just simply increasing resistance, so the load that the athlete has to lift or work with. They increase the repetitions and increase the sets. So it's just that concept of constantly increasing the workload to allow for those improvements to occur. So remember to watch the other videos in the Principles of Training series to ensure that you cover all the syllabus dot points in relation to the Principles of Training.